chapter 30, and will be in verse 3. Genesis chapter 30, picking up in verse 3. Genesis chapter 30, verse 3. The question we had last week when we started was, when are we most difficult to help? And we had some very good answers to that question. And I don't know that I tied it back specifically as once we got into the chapter, but we're going to see that Rachel is in a very hard position to be helped, as is Jacob then is in a hard position to be helped. And then Leah is also in a difficult situation to be helped. And regardless of the circumstances that cause us to be in need of help, all of us will find ourselves there at one point or another. And I think every time we need help, even if it's a spiritual issue, there's going to be some physical connection to it. And here, Rachel's thing, she says she wants to have children. So she comes up with an idea, and Jacob is going to go along with it. And we see here in verse 3, and Rachel said, "Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her." So the idea, we've seen this before. We saw it with Sarah and Abraham. Here's my handmaid. You can have children with her, and she will be my proxy. The phrase, shall bear upon my knees, refers to an ancient custom. Now, it's not certain that this is exactly what they did, but the phrase, bear them upon my knees, in the ancient world, if it was practiced completely, would mean that when the surrogate woman gave birth, she would sit on the lap of the actual mother and give birth while on the lap of the mother. So the mother could say, the child was born on my knees. But then sometimes, too, there's evidence in the ancient world that even when the handmaid or the surrogate was impregnated, that this would happen also while she was on the lap of the mother. And again, it's not for sure that this is what Jacob and Rachel did, but it is a practice known as surrogate adoption. And if they were to go to that extent, it just brings in again the will and the grace of God to work in spite of that. And we'll get to that idea here in just a second. So Rachel's idea is, you may have the handmaid, and the child that is born of her will be born upon my knees, and that way I can say that the child is mine. So verse 4, she gave Jacob Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife, and Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan, and the name Dan means judgment. And it's judgment in the way of vindication. God has judged me, and he has given me that which I've asked for. And we're going to see through this chapter, there's two sections in which the narrator, the writer, Moses, will step in and say, this is what God has done. And clearly God has allowed these children to be born. But we're going to see the names that each of these children are given by these different women. It's worth noting that we can interpret a reality the way we want to, but it doesn't mean that that's what is really true. Dan probably should have been named something else. In fact, all the names of these children, well, not all of them, but a couple of them probably could be simply given the names for stubbornness, envy, jealousy, hatred, because that's really what's motivating these women to say, we want to have these children be born. But anyways, the name Dan means judgment. Verse 7, and Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with Jehovah. That's not what it says, is it? With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister. And David Guzik points out, if it wasn't out in the open, it's out in the open now. These two sisters don't like each other, and they are competing with one another. And so Rachel will name this son Naphtali, which means wrestling. And so now Rachel has two children through surrogate adoption, and she has said, if we look back again at verse 8, I've wrestled with my sister and I have prevailed. I've won. And today, maybe modern terminology, Leah could just stand back and say, look at the scoreboard. I still have more kids, and I actually have more kids. You've got 2, and they're through a handmaid. And yet Rachel is still abiding by this mentality of, no, I've won. Verse 9, when Leah saw that she had left bearing. Now remember, the 4th child she gives birth to is Judah, and she names him Praise, right? The first 3 sons that Leah has, each time she names them, it's, I hope that this will unite me with Jacob. I hope this will unite with my husband. I hope this will bring my husband to me. And then when the 4th child is born, she leaves that off and says, I will give praise to Jehovah for giving me this child. And what's fascinating about that is, and I think David Guzik points this out too, is Leah can have that profound moment, but because she is human, like most of us, she will return back to that human nature that says, okay, I need to do things my way. And she's probably angry at Rachel. So verse 9, Leah sees that she's no longer having children, so she took Zilpah and gave Zilpah to Jacob to wife. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son, and Leah said, a troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. And the name Gad means a troop or a good fortune. So God's given me a good fortune. And we can always step back and say, why would God continue to allow these women to have children? He could have at any time just intervened and said, no, because the motivations of your heart are wrong, I won't give you children. And yet God in his will still allows these children to be born. And the women will interpret it as, this is God's blessing and I have been vindicated. And yet I think a larger story is, no, God is working his will in spite of ourselves. And that's really the big idea I want to take away from this passage. But let's continue on with so Gad means good fortune. And as Guzik notes, Leah seems to have lost the peace that the praise brought, right? She has that intimate moment with God, that moment that we can all point to and say, that's a spiritually mature move. And yet, because she is human, she will have those moments where she will veer back into her human nature. And we see this again and again in the New Testament with the Gospels, right? The disciples are there with Christ, and how often Christ is having to tell them, haven't you listened? Don't you know? O ye of little faith, right? It's human nature for us to slip back in or go back into our own trusting ourselves. Verse 12, and Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son, and Leah said, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher, and the name Asher means happy. But notice here, she says, this now will give me praise and recognition from the daughters, from all the women of the land, because bearing children is not only an admirable and a God-given responsibility, it's now become a sense of a place for idolatry and a place to get human praise. And Leah says, I've got all these kids now, I'm going to get recognized for it. And the one question I put here in my notes was mostly a question for me, but it's also good for us to have is, you will have your praise of man, and then what? Right? All of us like to be recognized. We like to get the honor, and it is right to give someone honor and recognition for what is due. But the praise of human beings is passing. And I've heard professional stand-up comedians talk about it again and again and again, that you can go out and stand before a massive audience and get everyone laughing, and the laughing of the crowd is the greatest feeling that you'll ever have. And then they say, we have to go back to that. And we have to go back to that. And the best praise is the praise in the moment. I'm going through a show right now, and 2 of the main characters are what you'd call has-beens. They're washed up. They have praise back in their younger days, and now that they're in their mid-60s, or as one guy said, in his early mid-60s, still young, they're not getting that praise and recognition that they got in their younger days, and it's hard for them to deal with. And it's very, very human here. But Leah says, now I'll get the praise that I want. And I have a note here that says, so we get the praise of man, Then what? Would that we lived in trust of the righteous judge's eternal commendation, for when he could say, well done, thou good and faithful servant, because that's an eternal praise. And we as humans might praise someone today and then tomorrow be their worst enemy. And that's not how God operates. So Leah considers her own status, and we have here this Game of Thrones, if you will, or game of cribs or games of rattlers. It is on, right? How many kids do you have? How many kids do you have? So then we go to verse 14. So Leah says, I'm happy, right? I'm going to get all this praise. And then we move into just more complications of this relationship. Verse 14. And Reuben, the firstborn, went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And a mandrake is part of the potato family, but it was believed in the ancient world to be both an aphrodisiac and to be a helper for fertility. So it's going to help you do the things you need to have kids, and it's going to help you have kids. So the son, Reuben, has found these for his mother, Leah. She already has more children than Rachel. And Rachel comes up to Leah and says, would you please give me this? And notice she calls them your son's mandrakes, right? Now watch Leah's response. And Leah said unto Rachel, is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? What's the answer to that question? You stole my man. No, that's a big deal, right? And what Leah's going to do here is she is going to use, in the world of argument, there's two tactics she uses. One is called epiplexis. It comes from the Greek. The first part, the epi, means upon, and plesion means to strike. She is going to strike upon her sister with this question, and this type of question is used to express grief, to inveigh guilt, you're guilty, and to chide, to reprimand. So the question is not, hey, I really want to have a conversation here. It's, I'm going to ask this question just to cut you down, let you know how upset I am, right? And we do this today even when, if the spouse does something or the kids do something and you look at them and say, how could you be so stupid, right? Did you really think that was helpful? But she's going to follow it up with a second question, and this in the world of argument is a tactic called the pisma, and it means to compound the questions together so that the response the person would give would need to be very complex. They would need to have a half an hour to an hour to answer the question. So Leah says, is it a small thing that you took my husband? And wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes? You have committed this ultimate sin against me, and this little thing that really shouldn't matter, now I don't even want to give you that because of this major wound that you've committed against me. And really, it's not Rachel who stole Jacob. Now, Rachel was involved in the marital swapping, right? She knew what was coming, but so was Leah. And really, Jacob loved Rachel from the start. The issue really isn't with Rachel as much as Rachel's been antagonistic and they're having this battle of babies, if you will. The issue lies with Leah needs to be talking to Jacob. And of course, when they won't answer, she needs to be taking her frustration to Jehovah. And of course, I'm sure all of us in this room know what that's like when we have an animosity with another human being, rightly or wrongly. Ultimately, we have to be able to take that to Jehovah for help, because human beings, while we can do some good working with each other, and we won't always be able to because we're so flawed ourselves. So Leah says, is it a small thing you took my husband and now you want to take my son's mandrakes? Watch what Rachel says. Rachel said, therefore, Jacob shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. You want to swap? We'll swap. And so we have where Jacob sold a pottage of soup to Esau for a birthright. Now we have Jacob's own wife selling him for mandrakes. So the real human connections here, even though they're desired, they're getting covered up with all these other things that we want. And so Rachel is willing, rather than getting into a whole discussion, rather than getting into a whole argument, she says, fine, just give me the mandrakes. Because what does Rachel want? She wants kids. She's already got the husband. She's already has the better looks, but she wants her own children. So she's willing to sell her husband, if you will. And Leah, who wants this husband, is going to take up on that offer because she's thinking every time if we get pregnant together, this will just endear Jacob to me. It's a pretty sad exchange here. So verse 16, Jacob came out of the field in the evening. This is the wheat harvest, right? He's a farmer. And Leah went out to meet him and said, thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with thy son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. So the point I've already mentioned, but I just want to drive it home again today, is because we're going to see it in the next verse, the human interactions with each other for the things that they want. Just these few verses alone, it is pretty shameful what we as humans can do in order to get the things we want. And yet God, still in his loving kindness, is at times will give us the things we want, but probably not for the reasons we think he's giving them to us. And it certainly is not so that we can be praised and recognized. So we have verse 17. And this is where Moses, the writer of the text, moves in and says, God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived and bare Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I gave my maiden to my husband. And she called his name Issachar. And Issachar means reward. God's given me my reward for all my hard work. Look at all these things I did, and therefore God is blessing me. But I think the truth of the matter is, no, God has given you a child because he has a greater will that's higher, and you can put a label that you want to on it, but that does not mean that's why God's given you this thing. Next verse. And Leah, God had given him a hire. Verse 19. And Leah conceived again, and she bears a sixth son. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun, which means honored. And now we get back to that deepest thing that Leah wants. She wants to be loved by her husband. And it begs the question, why couldn't Jacob love her as she should have? The answer might be because you can't love 2 women. Even though the world will tell us you can love 2 people at the same time, right? You can be married to this person and have this emotional connection with this person. You can do that, but you cannot. So they're in an impossible situation. So Leah has these 6 sons now, and verse 21, afterwards she bare a daughter and called her name Dinah. And in the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, there's no celebration for the name of Dinah. And it is a reality that while there is still good treatment of women throughout the world, and God still loves the woman for he created her, it certainly doesn't mean that they have always been treated as they should. And here we have this daughter who's been born, and her name means justice and vindication and judgment, but there's no celebration that her mom gives for her, right? I'll celebrate because I've got these sons, because that's what everyone wants. That's the trophy thing. I've got this kid, I'll give her a name, and we're not going to really say a whole lot about that. Verse 23, or 22, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. So he hearkened unto Leah, not for the reasons Leah thinks. He gives Leah these children, and then he hearkens unto Rachel and opened her womb. Verse 23, and she conceived and bare a son and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, which means Jehovah has added. So this child has come to me from God. And she then says, the Lord Jehovah shall add to me another son. So this desire for a son of her own, God answers her prayer. He hearkens to her. He gives her this child, and she names him a great name. God has added this child unto me. And then she follows it up immediately with, and he'll give me another. And I think, I don't want to oversimplify because I know that human beings are much more complex than that. Her statement that God will give me another child might be a statement out of she's truly not satisfied. This one thing that I thought would satisfy me isn't. I want more and I want more and I want more. It might also be if she knows that Jehovah gives her one child, is it unreasonable to think if God gave me one, he can give me another? And to have confidence that he'll give me another? Maybe it's a combination of all these going on. But Rachel finally gives birth to her own child, and we will see the ramifications of that with that son as time will pass on. And we will see this truth played out more that I've already mentioned, but I'll end it with this, is all of these verses here in this chapter, all of Scripture for sure, but especially these passages now where we're seeing Jacob's marriage to Leah and Rachel, and we're going to see the story of Joseph play out. This is an example of God listening and providing for us in spite of ourselves. And we might claim a victory in the name of God because of some great thing we've done, and really it's probably God showing us a great deal of mercy and grace. I will give you this thing, but because I have a higher purpose than yourself. And so the thing I'll end on with today is, for God to be good to us, for God to be able to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant, requires a loving kindness from God that should leave us in awe of him. So much of human nature, and even today, even in the world of religion and even in the world of Christianity, and I heard something the other day, is geared towards ourselves. I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. And it is a shuffling away or an ignoring of God. And studying these humans live out their life and make all these mistakes and have all these very human failures, it is like holding a mirror right up. Like, man, you make all these same mistakes. And yet God hasn't cast you off, and you can see where God has still blessed you, maybe in a small way or in a simple way here. And it doesn't mean that we have no part to play, but we fool ourselves to think that any reward we get from God is simply because of us, because we're so good. And if we think about it, any of you that are any good at anything, right? Let's say you're pretty good at whatever it is. So take God and make it perfect, and then we come along and try to be like God. I mean, how close can we possibly get? And yet he still is gracious enough to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. That is a loving kindness that I can't comprehend. And so rather than, I know for myself, to stand back and say, well, you had this because you did this great and wonderful thing, or, you know, God needs to bless you and he needs to do all these things. And rather it's a step back and say, God is so very good, and I need to be more often in awe of him rather than caught up in how great I am or how angry I am or how I deserve A, B, C, D, right? Because even in this life, if the kingdom of God is here now as it is, in the life yet to come when his kingdom has complete, full authority over everything, for him to still let us in there and to reward us is truly magnanimous, is greater than certainly we deserve. So we'll come back next week. We have this event. If things already weren't complicated enough for Jacob and his family, now his family's going to make a move and they're going to enter into another challenging situation for their life. We'll look at that next week, all right? Okay, thank you.